Welcome or welcome back to the Company of the Cat. Hi! Today I'm going back to the roots of this channel, so this is a theory about Andals and Ironborn, and whoever knows me and the channel knows that they are by far my favorite stuff to talk about, but also Valyria. The old Valyria, the true, before dragons were cool. Just so you know, throughout the video I'm gonna repeat some stuff I have said in previous videos as well, but I think they are quite important, so that's why they are gonna be here as well. I will explain in more detail and add other things to them as well, so it won't be boring to the people already familiar with my other uploads. The video is gonna be quite long, so have a cup of tea. About the Iron Islands, I have a theory that in summary suggests that the Iron Islands are volcanic, and in my Hammer of the Waters video, I said that they were a peninsula, most likely. The islands are quite mountainous, they have ore, and they were forested. We have all this in the area beside them, the Westerlands. The isles are very close to mainland Westeros, and there are myths about them drowning, and most importantly, the oldest known castle, which is massive and half sunk. So I think it makes sense they were a peninsula. Now about the volcanism, first of all, there is a very prominent caldera. Aaron described Old Wick as having windy hills and cruel black mountains, and the Iron Islands are pretty much known for being barren. There is a misconception about all volcanic areas being fertile, but that's not entirely true. Volcanic places can be very fertile because of the minerals in the volcanic ash, but other elements like a good climate, fresh water sources, and decent soil consistency are also needed in order to make it work. The islands in the South Aegean volcanic arc, like Santorini, aren't exactly garden paradises. Santorini's soil, for instance, is like a mix of desert sand and lunar rock fragments. It consists of basalt, volcanic ashes, pumice stone, and various types of lava. And it doesn't retain waters well because it is very rocky and poor in clays. This is very reminiscent of Old Wick, if you ask me, and I think the reason is because the crater is there. Great Wick, Orkmond, and Harlow are different and are not as barren. They're pretty forested and mountainous. Great Wick's got soldier pines all over its mountains, and Orkmond and Harlow used to be forested until the Ironborn used up the timber for shipbuilding. To me, this island seems similar to Nisiros, another volcanic island in the Aegean volcanic arc. It's got a lot of trees because the soil holds moisture well enough, but its uneven terrain makes farming very difficult. The second reason I think the islands are volcanic is their ore deposits. The Iron Islands are known for their abundance in iron, lead, and tin ores. Tin production is closely linked to granitic rocks and volcanic equivalents. Volcanic activity can play a role in hosting valuable ore deposits, including hydrothermal lead deposits in calderas. The Iron Islands' vast iron deposits are reminiscent of Kiruna-type iron deposits that in real life are linked to volcanic activity as well. Given the volcanic origins of these deposits and the region's geomorphy, it's likely that volcanic activity exists. In my video, there was also a great comment about the names chosen by George Martin. That the Iron Islands were once volcanic is very much hinted at in the names Old Wick and Great Wick, Wick being wordplay on wick as in cattle wick or the wick of an oil lamp, which of course enables the flame. Plus myths surrounding the Iron Islands such as the Grey King's use of Naga's living fire for warmth and Naga's ability to drown whole islands hints at geothermal energy and past volcanic eruptions possibly involving a caldera collapse. Naga might have been the volcano itself, with the creature they slayed on Old Wick being actually just a normal dragon living there. If we take into consideration that dragons like to fish and deep dive into the sea like Viserion and Grey Ghost, Naga could have been eating sea creatures. Grey Ghost was a wild dragon in Dragonstone in Dragonmount. He was a shy, pale grey-white dragon who avoided men and their works for years at a time. He preferred to feed on fish and was often glimpsed flying low over the narrow sea, snatching prey from the waters. If they hadn't seen a dragon before, but knew stories about them, and saw a dragon so close to the sea with bluish, greyish, greenish color, they could have been like, oh, a sea dragon. And even if they had seen one before, they were calling her the sea dragon because she liked the sea and was living near it. That doesn't necessarily mean that she was a sea monster. At least this is what I think. Now, most fans agree that Naga's bones aren't from a sea dragon or any creature. The top theory is that they're leftovers from the Grey King's first ship, made out of the demon tree, Ig, and I agree. The idea lines up with weirwood turning into stone over time, and the hints in the name Ig. Ig as a name is a reference to both Ig, the father of serpents in the Lovecraft mythos, and Yggdrasil, the war tree in Norse mythology that inspired the weirwoods. And at the roots of Yggdrasil there was a dragon, so in both stories we see that reptiles are involved. Ironborn ships are inspired by Viking longships, according to Martin, which often had dragon heads up for protection during sea journeys. Like the Valyrians with their dragons, the Ironborn took pride in their ships, which were quite unique back when advanced navigation wasn't widespread in Westeros. So it's possible they called the ship Naga the Sea Dragon because it had a dragon carving, like the sea creature carvings Ironborn ships have in our story. In many semi-canon art, like the histories and lore, they have Grey King ships with Naga carved on the prow. Since the Ironborn don't have written history, to this day the stories got mixed up with time. As it is the case with most myths and legends, there are many alternations and different versions depending on who tells the story. So my guess is that there was a dragon there. Since the islands look volcanic, the Grey King killed it and carved its likeness on the boat. And all three had the same name, something that we see happening very often in the series, giving similar names or the same names for many things/people. The drowned god had made them to rave and rape, to carve out kingdoms and write their names in fire and blood and song. In general, the Ironborn and the drowned god are closely linked to fire. Both the Ironborn of old and the Ironborn in the current timeline have storylines heavily linked to fire magic. In Riverrun, they would tell you different. They say the Red Comet is a herald of a new age, a messenger from the gods. A sign it is, the priest agreed, but from our god, not theirs. A burning brand it is, such as our people carried of old. It is the flame the drowned god brought from the sea, and it proclaims a rising tide. It is time to hoist our sails, go forth into the world with fire and sword as he did. A wizard, could the drowned god have sent a gift to him, here on the far side of the world? His brother Aeron would have known, but Aeron had seen the majesty of the drowned god's watery halls below the sea before being returned to life. Victarion had a healthy fear of his gods, as all men should, but put his faith in steel. He flexed his wounded hand, grimacing, then pulled the gloves on and rose. So with his wizard, Grief's master, awaited them on the deck. A small man, as hairy as he was homely, he was a spar by birth. His men called him the Vole. Lord Captain, he said when Victarion appeared, this is Mokoro, a gift to us from the drowned god. Victarion fished a fire made from the sea and had his hand healed by him, making his faith slowly expand to include R'hllor. We see him believe in both gods now. He could almost hear the god's voice welling up from the depths of the sea. You shall serve me well, my captain, the waves seemed to say. It was for this I made you. But he would feed the red god too, Mokoro's fire god. The arm the priest had healed was hideous to look upon, pork crackling from elbow to fingertips. Sometimes when Victarion closed his hand, the skin would split and smoke. Yet the arm was stronger than it had ever been. 2 gods are with me now, he told the dusky woman. No foe can stand before 2 gods. We are the Ironborn, and 2 gods look over us. The Ironborn are the ones with the dragon horn. The Ironborn are the ones with a leader who has a Valyrian steel suit of armor. And they are the ones who have 2 gods looking over them. And all these are very similar to the stories we have about the Ironborn of old. They have stories about black soul-drinking weapons, they had a magical horn, they had a warrior who apparently had skin that was black and so hard that sword could not hurt him. Who, if you ask me, sounds a lot like Vic. The Ironborn were demons, risen from some watery hell protected by fell sorceries, and possessed of foul black weapons that drank the very souls of those they slew. Thus we hear of the likes of Torgon the Terrible, Yor the Whale, Dagon Drum the Necromancer, Hrothgar of Pike and his kraken summoning horn, and Ragd Ralph of Old Wick. Most infamous of all was Balon Blackskin, who fought with an axe in his left hand and a hammer in his right. No weapon made of man could hurt him, it was said. Swords glanced off and left no mark, and axes shattered against his skin. The Ironborn were and still are very closely linked to fire, and if indeed there is a drowned volcano on the islands, as I think, then all these links to fire magic and the stories about how the drowned god brought the flame from the sea start to make sense. After all, he made them to carve out kingdoms and write their names in fire and blood and songs. Doesn't this sound familiar? Because to me it sounds very much like Valyrians minus the dragons. And if indeed their ships of old had dragon carvings on the prows, like in the histories and lore, since they killed a dragon after all, the parallel is even more obvious, and like the Valyrians, they used slaves for mining and they had so much reach and power. The myths and legends the Ironborn themselves and the rest of Westeros have about them suggest that at the time, like the Valyrians, the Ironborn were the top dog, and to me they sound quite fiery as well. Many legends have come down to us through the millennia of the Salt Kings and ravers who made the Sunset Sea their own, men as wild and cruel and fearless as any have ever lived. Under my video about the Velaryons, the Celtigars, and the Valyrian Schism, there was a comment. Might be a coincidence, but it's also interesting how many of the Ironborn names share suffixes with Valyrian names like On, Eon, and Gon. Ironborn names like Victarion, Balon, Aeron, Veron, Dagon wouldn't sound out of place on a Dark or Velaryon. And it is true, they do have many names that sound very Valyrian. The Velaryons are an ancient Valyrian house that came to Westeros before the Targaryens and settled at the Gauntlet on the island of Driftmark. Their original seat is the castle of Driftmark, where their ancient seat, the Driftwood Throne, was. According to legend, the throne had been given to them by the Merlin King to conclude a pact. They were not dragon riders, the sea was their element, and they are to this day exceptionally good at navigation. Unlike the Targaryens, they came to Westeros way earlier and not because they knew about the Doom. Additionally, they didn't settle in a castle that was a Valyrian outpost like Dragonstone, they built their own. And even before the dance, Driftmark was a very old, gloomy dump and suffered from floods. This is why Corlys built High Tide. In the video I explained why I think the Velaryons and maybe the Celtigars left the freehold at the same time the religious schism happened in Valyria. For some reason, in House of the Dragon, they decided to give a piece of information about them, which I found very curious. House Velaryon has entirely different customs and religion too, to the Targaryens, who like most Dragon Lords of old were not very religious. So the Dragon Bond is not the only difference. The scene that made me raise my eyebrows was Lyanna's funeral, and there must have been some input by George Martin himself. I haven't seen anything to confirm that, but I doubt that the Valyrian chants and songs came completely out of the imagination of the writers, especially looking at the lyrics of most. So George must have had a say in them.
Rasma laina renniot en eglio ilvo lanto pelotti hembes. Koja munya hen ziho solio amosilos da uor. Ja ana grossa kieri os di taxi on bilda. Bilario ano grore lopo ojares. Ilvon cumbiliares. Ilvon treci iares. Sidore vaginigon
as kids, and how Laenor is not their natural father, but that doesn't change the very obvious similarities to the Ironborn and the many differences with the Targaryens. The first three men had offered their lives to the drowned god fearlessly, but the fourth was weak in faith and began to struggle as his lungs cried out for air. Standing waist deep in the surf, Aeron sees the naked boy by the soldiers and puts his head back down as he tried to snatch a breath. "Have courage," he said. "We came from the sea, and to the sea we must return. Open your eyes and drink deep of God's blessing. Fill your lungs with water that you may die and be reborn. It does no good to fight." True Ironborn had salt water in their veins, the priest of the drowned god proclaimed. The black-blooded horse were false kings, ungodly usurpers who must be cast down. "It is as I feared. The Greenlands have made you soft, and the Starks have made you theirs. You're wrong. Ned Stark was my gaoler, but my blood is still salt and iron." The Targaryens have fire in their blood, so the Velaryons have much more in common in their culture with the Ironborn rather than the Targaryens. Another big similarity is their imagery and some of their stories. The island of Driftmark was gifted to them along with the Driftwood Throne by the Merlin King, and this throne sounds very similar to the Ironborn throne that was allegedly lost. As I said above, it is heavily hinted at by the author and speculated by the fandom that this throne, like Naga's bones and the Grey King's crown, which they called Driftwood Crown, was weirwood. Many of the descriptions we get about Driftmark are very similar to the description of Harlow, an ancient Ironborn seat, that got replaced with a more elaborate seat similar to High Tide, both of them grand with beaten silver details. And the connections continue with the Celtigars as well. We have the magical Kraken summoning horn, This type of horn had appeared twice in stories around Westeros, once when Hrothgar of Pike, an Ironborn of old, had it, and once in the current timeline where it is allegedly in the possession of the Celticars. And these, along with the very unique names, have made most people in the fandom raise their eyebrows. The thing is that there are also many Andal houses, especially from Dorne, that sound quite Valyrian, I would say. Houses like Illyrion, Corgyle, Santagar, Uller, Veith, Gargalen do not sound very Andal to me. Σε αυτό το σημείο θέλω να πω ότι το όνομα Gargalen μου φαίνεται απίστευτα αστείο. Πραγματικά μου φαίνεται απίστευτα. Τους λένε Gargalen ρε μαλάκα. The other thing about Andals, especially the early Andals we learn about, could be considered very Ironborn-like. We have many legendary Andal warriors, and if someone gets a description without knowing that they are Andals, they sound straight up Ironborn. Torgold the Grim, this man was called, but even his name was a J, for it is written that he went into battle laughing, naked above the waist, with a bloody 7-pointed star carved across his chest, and an axe in its hand. If the carving was not a star, I could easily believe he was an Ironborn warrior of old. The songs say that Torgold knew no fear and felt no pain. The giant died choking on his last laugh, the singers say. Drox the Corpsemaker is again a name I could easily see an Ironborn having, but he also was an Andal warrior during the invasion. Another Andal who tried to invade the north was Argos 7-star, a name very similar to Argoth, which we have seen in Dawn Age stories from the Reeds. Maris the Maid, the most fair, whose beauty was so renowned that 50 lords vied for her hand at the first tourney ever to be held in Westeros. The victor was the Grey Giant, Argoth Stoneskin, but Maris wed King Uthor of the High Tower before he could claim her. And Argoth spent the rest of his days raging outside the walls of Old Town roaring for his bride. I will not deep dive very deep into Argoth because I have 2 videos where I discuss him, but I am gonna bet he was an Ironborn. And the founder of House Hightower, Uthor, was also from the same bands as the Ironborn and was not a firstman. If we take a look, we see that the majority of the firstman houses close to the sea are older than the ones on the inner mainland, and they have a slightly different culture as well. We are told that all these houses were firstmen, but unlike the rest of the firstmen, they were great navigators and traders, which wasn't the stronger suit of the earlier firstmen. There are enough differences that even some maesters consider the possibility that some of these houses, like the Ironborn and the High Towers, were not firstmen. And looking at the names and imagery we get from all these houses, I think they were indeed the same group of people and got split after the breaking of the arm. Always seafarers, often depicted with grey, fishy characteristics and close to the sea. Also had similar ships, similar constructions, and similar names. The names Uthor and Urigon are very peculiar names for firstmen. We do not see them very often. We see the name Uthor more, but the name Urigon is one that we only see in Ironborn characters, along with similar names like Uragon, Uras, Uron, and Urathon. Another similarity we see is the fixation that both the Hightowers and the Ironborn had with the conquest by sea. Many Hightowers, like many Ironborn of old, had the reputation of being necromancers. There has been noted a certain likeness between the black stone of the base of the High Tower and that of the sea stone chair, and additionally the colors grey and green are often associated with both the High Towers and the Ironborn. The reason I am bringing this specific story up is that the names Uthor and Argoth are similar or the same names we see in Andals like Argos 7-star, Uthor Tolet, and Uthor Uller. In general, Andal names, especially old Andal names, or in areas where they were more isolated like Dorne, are a very weird combination of Valyrian and Ironborn sounding names. Torgold the Grim, Argos, Kyle, Drox the Corpsemaker, Uthor Uller, Simon and Silva Sandagar, Quentin Corgyle, Vorian Vipren and Gargalen are very eye-catching for that very reason, I would say. The Andals of antiquity in general were very similar to the Ironborn as a culture. The religions aside, their whole stick was often attacking from the sea, maybe not to the point of we do not sow, but attacking from the sea and conquering was an Andal habit for years. It's worth noticing that the Andals of old and the Ironborn had the same type of ships. It is pointed out that longships are a smaller type of ship primarily used by the Ironborn, but also coastal lords and the Andals of antiquity. They, in turn, were displaced by Andals, pushing north from Andalos to the shores of Lorath Bay and across the bay in longships. Clad in main and wielding iron swords and axes, the Andals swept across the islands, slaughtering the hairy men in the name of their seven-faced god and taking their women and children as slaves. Sounds familiar, I would say, and let's not forget that the Andals brought iron and fire to Westeros as well. The first men who were there before the Andals fought these seaborne conquerors stubbornly, But the Vale was but thinly peopled in those days, and they soon found themselves outnumbered in every fight. No sooner was one longship set aflame or driven back into the sea, the singers say, than 10 more rose from the dawn. Axes are also very important to both Andals and the Ironborn. The Ironborn use them as weapons more often than the rest of the Westerosi, and they also have the finger dance as a game as well. When we still kept the old way, lived by the axe instead of the pick, taking what we would, be it wealth, women, or glory. Afterward, the victors could not agree on who should succeed Ragnar as king, so it was decided that they would settle the matter by dancing the finger dance, a game popular amongst the Ironborn, wherein players swing a throwing axe at one another and attempt to snatch it from the air. It is pointed out all the time that the Andals of old used to attack clad in mail and wielding iron swords and axes. The proof of the claim lies in the stones, carved all above the fingers, which bear images of stars, swords, and axes, or hammers, as some have argued. So axes were carved along the stars of the seven, most likely, so they must have been significant at the time. Archmaester Perestan notes the importance the Norvosi give to the axe as a symbol of power and might, and processes that this is a proof that the Andals were the first to settle Norvos, suggesting the bearded priests took the emblem from ruins they found as they established Great Norvos. As he argues, next to the carvings of 7-pointed stars, carvings of double-bladed axe appear to have been the next most favored symbol of the holy warriors who conquered the old seven kingdoms. Etched in stone by Archmaester Harmon contains a catalogue of such carvings found throughout the Vale. Stars and axes are found from the fingers into the mountains of the moon, and even as far into the Vale of Arryn as the base of the giant's lance. Harmon supposes that with time the Andals became more devoted to the symbol of the 7-pointed star, and so the axe fell by the wayside as the emblem of the seven. When the Andals arrived in Westeros, there was also the matter of the Iron Islands. Even the Ironborn, the fierce sea-roving warriors who must have at first thought themselves safe upon their isles, fell to the wave of Andal conquest. For though it took 1,000 years for the Andals to turn their attention to the Iron Islands, when they did so with renewed zeal. In due time, the Andals swept over the islands, just as they had all Westeros below the neck. Successive waves of Andals adventurers descended on the islands, often in alliance with one of another faction of the Ironborn themselves. The Andals intermarried with some of the ancient families of the islands and brought others to a bloody end, with sword and axe. House Grey Iron was amongst those destroyed. The last Iron King, Ragnar II, was brought down when the Orkwood's drums, whores, and Greyjoys made common cause against him, supported by a host of Andal pirates, sellswords, and warlords. The Andals were pushed back because they wanted to force the faith on the Ironborn, and even when they indeed established themselves on the Isles, the Seven never took off. One of the reasons the Andals stayed is because the Ironborn wanted to remove the Grey Irons, and made an alliance. Though I pray it is not bloody, I have been consulting Hareg's history of the Ironborn. When last the Salt Kings and the Rock Kings met in Kingsmoot, Euron of Orkmont let his axemen loose among them, and Naga's ribs turned red with gore. House Grey Iron ruled unchosen for 1,000 years from that dark day, until the Andals came. The Grey Irons were considered ungodly, since they were not chosen by the Kingsmoot, and for many years they ruled as hereditary kings. The next Ironborn dynasty was that of the Horse. Afterward, the victors could not agree on who should succeed Ragnar as king, so it was decided that they would settle the matter by dancing the finger dance. Harras Hor emerged as victor, at the cost of 2 fingers. As Harras Stamphand, he ruled the Iron Islands for 30 years. Many believe the tale of Harras winning his crown by catching an axe to be no more than a singer's fancy. In truth, Archmaester Hareg suggests that Harras was chosen because he had taken an Andal maiden for his wife, thereby winning the support of her father and many other powerful Andal lords. The Horse was another house of kings despised by the Ironborn because they had the Andal taint, since they were taking Andal queens, and were accused of being false kings, which Archmaester Haig agreed with, referring to them as black of hair, black of eye, and black of heart. Some Hor kings we know from that era were Wulfgar the Widowmaker, his great-grandson Horgan Priestkiller, Fergon the Fierce, Othgar the Soulless, Othgar Demon Lover, and Craghorn of the Red Smile. Archmaester Hareg praised these Hor kings for bringing the faith of the Seven to the Iron Islands, discouraging raving, and promoting trade. But to be honest, considering these names and reputation of the Horse in general, as well as what we know about other members of the house after this, like the 3 Harmons, Harmon the Host, Harmon the Haggler, and Harmon the Handsome, the last of whom was overthrown and replaced by his brother, Hargon the Heartless, it is very obvious that the ravings continued, since at the time the Ironborn were at their peak. Maybe they brought the Seven and intermarried with other houses from the mainland, but stopping the raving? That's a hard doubt. House Lannister led the Westerlands in invading and crushing the Ironborn, and the Hor Castle on Great Wick was seized to the ground because the Ironborn were such a huge problem. After that, the horse promoted trade with Lannisport, Oldtown, and the Free Cities. After centuries, we also see the horse expanding through the Trident to the Riverlands, with the last member of the house being Harren the Black, who built Harrenhal and was roasted by Aegon during the conquest. Looking at the horse and the Grey Irons, there isn't that much of a difference, even though the horse were considered Andals. And looking at the Andals and the Ironborn in general, we see they were pretty much same people, different font. Now, Andals with Valyrians, it's trickier. As we saw before, the names, especially the Dornish names, are quite a big question mark. Illyrion, Sandagar, Uller, Vaith, Korgyle, and Gargallen were all Andal houses founded by Andal adventurers, along with houses like Jourdain, Tolland, and Martell, and possibly the now extinct Drylands. I think that if someone isn't familiar with houses like Illyrion, Sandagar, or Korgyle, and has only watched House of the Dragon, for example, and got asked about them, I'm pretty sure they would say that these names are Valyrian. And for a very good reason, since they sound Valyrian. The Andals are also quite fair, similarly fair to the Valyrians. Hugor of the Hills in semi-canon art looks more like a Valyrian than many Valyrians. They for sure were fair enough to be noticeable to the first men, since the wordbook is commenting on them. House Starks in the current timeline has Andal blood, and if they are or were similarly looking to Brienne, we are talking about very fair-haired people with pale eyes. Since, as far as we are aware, there has been no weddings to the Targaryens, and the one wedding with a Velaryon woman was to a second son and produced one daughter that later married an Estermond. The Aryans are also described as very blonde and blue-eyed, and generally, for maesters and firstmen to point it out, they most likely, as a whole, were fairly more light-colored than them. The Andals were the first, a race of tall, fair-haired warriors who came with steel and fire and the seven-pointed star of the new gods painted on their chests. And those who would not be slaves, but were unable to withstand the might of Valyria fled. Many failed and are forgotten, but one people, tall and fair-haired, made courageous and indomitable by their faith, succeeded in their escape from Valyria, and those men are the Andals. In some of my videos about the Andal invasion, I listed the similarities of the Andal conquest to the Targaryen one, since we are now aware of the Targaryen prophecy. In general, there is a big question mark on when the Andals came to Westeros. The main dates are 3, and I have talked about it many times, but it makes sense for all of them to be correct, and the invasion to have been in waves. The first bunch of Andals we learn about on the Vale say nothing about Valyrians. They talk about a vision the Seven sent them about Westeros. First of all, the first wave came horny for battle, and the kingdoms that the Seven promised them, not because of the Valyrian expansion. The first Andal wars we learn about had a very specific goal, getting the kingdoms they were promised and uniting the whole of Westeros through faith. Even though we do not know exactly what was in Hugor's vision, it seems like it was more than golden land and mountains. They wanted to spread the faith at whatever cost. A dream about Westeros with a goal to unite all people under one banner sounds pretty much like Aegon's conquest. The difference is in their beliefs. The Andals' goal was one nation under God, for everyone to be followers of the Seven, and they fought for their religion. It sounds like both dreams were about Westeros united at any cost and kingdoms in the West. So yeah, the Andals maybe do not have as many similarities as the Valyrians do with the Ironborn or the Andals with the Ironborn, but there are enough parallels, and along with their names, it is suspicious enough. And now for the big question, why do they have so much stuff in common? I think because they originated in the same area, and the area in question is most likely the Valyrian Peninsula. So, we have zero idea about where the hell the Ironborn came from, but they do not sound very firstmen. Were the firstmen truly first? Most scholars believe they are. The Andals are also a group that we do not know their exact place of origin. Some say the Axe, and others say the land south of the Dothraki Sea, then Silver Sea. The Andals originated in the lands of the Axe, east and north of Pentos now lies, though they were for many centuries a migratory people who did not remain in one place for long. The Andals too may have arisen in the fertile fields south of the Silver Sea. So Andals were very much people who didn't stay for long at the same place and were constantly migrating before they founded Andalos. Before explaining why I think that both the Andals and the Ironborn originated in Valyria, I want to say something I said in my Don't Age Houses video. I do not buy that the Ironborn came from the west. I have talked about it before, it is most likely a misconception. Martin himself has said that no one has ever crossed the Sunset Sea to learn what lies on the other side. so I do not believe that the Ironborn or the High Towers came from the west, or that Elisa Farman reached Asai through the Sunset Sea. We do not know what happened to Sunchaser. Piracy, storms, ocean currents, and treacherous waters in general do exist. Also, we never learned when and how she died, so maybe they changed direction or whatever. Since the author himself has said that no one has crossed the Sunset Sea, I don't see the reason to come up with theories that involve something like this. With the army intact, obviously people from the southern parts of Essos who would have wanted to settle and had ships would have settled at the ridge and the last north of it. Since Dorne was a wasteland, this is why seafaring houses from the Dawn Age are found on the west coast, because the east wouldn't have been accessible at the time. Now, about the Great Empire of the Dawn. I do believe that there was an empire in the east, obviously. Asai is huge and ancient. Someone was there and they were very powerful too. The area we are told that the empire covered is enormous. Now, at that point it must have been even larger, since there were large land masses in the north that are now mostly sunken. The Great Sun Sea was fertile, and we do not know whether they had claim over parts west of the Bones too. So the whole, they were people from the Great Empire of the Dawn, is a very vague statement. 100%, if there was such a big empire, the people composing it would have been from different races, each with their own history and culture. At some point, Romans, Egyptians, and Britons were a part of the Roman Empire, but we do not consider all of them Romans. And in Universe, we saw the same thing happening. Technically speaking, Dothraki, Sarnori, and people from northern Sothorios, at some point, were a part of the Valyrian freehold, but they were not considered Valyrians. There are many theories about the Great Empire of the Dawn, and to be honest, many of them are not very convincing to me for various reasons. First of all, I doubt they were dragon riders. Were the dragons from the east? Yes, they still exist in the Far East. Bran saw them in his dream where he flew. But if all these dynasties had dragons, we would have at least one more myth, I think, because right now we have exactly 0 of them. They were a magic-depending empire like the Valyrians most likely, and they most definitely tried to do something with a dragon bond before the Long Night. But I doubt it worked for them considering the state of Asai and the lack of myths or something about them having dragons and using them to the extent the Valyrians did. I know, then what about Dany's vision? Want to wake the dragon. Ghosts lined in the hallways dressed in the faded remnants of kings. In their hands were swords of pale fire. They had hair of silver, and hair of gold, and hair of platinum white. And their eyes were opal, amethyst, tourmaline, and jade. Faster, they cried. Faster. Faster. It is a vision, and it is most definitely quite symbolic, like most of them are. The dragons came from the east. The Valyrians were using the same or similar magic to the people from Dawn, most likely. That's the very Valyrian-looking people, but with eyes reminiscent of the dual emperors. The people there tried to do something during the Long Night, yes, but the Valyrians were the ones who woke the dragons in the end, and this dream took place before her pyre. The reason I say this is because the blonde and silver hair have to do with the Valyrians, and not the people from the Empire, most likely. It is to draw the parallel and the connection about the dragons and the type of magic between the two, I think. Let's not forget that Valyrian stories claim that dragons originated in their lands, but there are tales from Asai claiming they were brought to Valyria from the Shadowlands, and the Valyrians tamed the dragons with magic taught by vanished people from the Shadowlands, according to the Asai. So there is a connection, and Dany's vision was about this connection 99%, I think. Maybe, and this is a big maybe by the way, the dual emperors had white hair, but we are not sure, and personally I do not buy it either. I do not think that in a place where the inhabitants are very clearly described as not white, there would have been so many people who are described very clearly pale as shit. Even the Ironborn who are not as blonde, even though let's not forget the salt waves, are very clearly described as white. Thus the Ironborn were not from the Great Empire of the Dawn, since the groups of people east of the Bones are described as non-white. And the Andals definitely do not have a connection to the Empire, again, are described as pale. The Valyrians who were not dragon riders are very white with silver hair as well, but do not have purple eyes, except from when they had Targaryen blood. So even before the dragons, people in Valyria were most likely very fair. And I think that would be cool imagery-wise as well, if the people in Valyria were indeed blonde with blue eyes. The ones who became dragon lords, meaning only these 40 families, and had the fire in their blood and the blood of the dragon, have purple eyes since red and blue make purple. Many times we have all these people and myths from the Dawn Age connected in our minds, but we do not have any indication that this is actually the case. And I doubt it was. If we think about the current story, many people at some point will meet and fight the Long Night together. but for the most part, these people have separate storylines. Take as an example Dany and Bran. Both have a huge role to play. One is a Greenseer and the other walk dragons, and in the future they might meet, but as of now, their stories are not connected. They will just face the same issue in the future, the Long Night. After 5,000 years, these stories will most definitely become very elaborate and different from the actual events. So I think that considering them facts is as inaccurate as not taking them into consideration at all. So no, I don't think that Ironborn, Andals, or the Proto-Valyrians were from the Great Empire of the Dawn. I am sorry. Now, let's see why it makes sense for the Ironborn to originate in the Valyrian Peninsula. First of all, pre-Hammer, the area looked like a great place for settlements, even more for trading settlements and ports. The peninsula was bigger than it is now. The place was by the seaside and close to two of the biggest civilizations. Northern Sothorios, that was obviously hot shit at the time, since the ruined cities are described as enormous, and the Great Empire of Gis. The Great Empire of Gis also controlled the Skahazat Han at the time, and before the Hammer, this river was most definitely a major route for passing stuff from the Seafaring Sea to the Summer Sea. We are told that the Warden of the River is a title granted in Mirin to the Guardian of the Skahazat Han. The official is in charge of ferries, dredges, and irrigation dishes along the river for 50 leagues, and according to his Zolorak, it is an ancient office, so trading settlements were 100% present in the area. It is a great place for seafaring confederation to originate from. If the Ironborn were from around that area, along with people like the Hideours and the Farmans, then some of the questions we have about them are easier to answer, I would say. First of all, they are very fair, yes, even for people in these areas, but we had other group of people that are described as very white near them as well, the Kathi. So it does make sense. Second of all these people are described as traders, seafarers, and explorers. So if they were on the hunt for new areas to settle, and they went west, obviously they settled on the southwest coast of Westeros, since it was the first place to settle they came across. And not only it is a great place, but it was also empty. It is clear that the Iron Islands before the Hammer of the Waters were not that bad. They had ore, as well as timber, and if the myths are true, some geothermal energy as well. It was a good place. Old Town is again a great place, still is, as it is the rest of the coastline of the Reach and the Westerlands. The Ironborn, from what we see after the Hammer of the Waters, ditched trading completely, but that doesn't mean they didn't start as traders like the Hideours or the Farmans, even if they did the occasional raving. The Ironborn have many parallels to both Vikings and Mycenaeans, and both these groups of people were plunderers as much as they were traders and explorers. And lastly, it explains the damn chair. If they were from this peninsula, they were in contact with the people from Sothorios, the other place with slimy, watery stuff, and they could have acquired the chair from here. Through trade, through plundering, through some pact or marriage, through settlements. We cannot be sure, but there are many reasons for the Ironborn to be in contact and have artifacts from Sothorios. So yeah, if I had to place the Ironborn somewhere in Essos, I would place them in the Valyrian Peninsula. It makes sense, they have common names and imagery to the Valyrians, and also many parallels. The Andals too, I think, were from the surrounding area and started to move when the Hammer hit. It would explain the similarities of the early Andals with the Ironborn and their differences as well, since they got separated a long time ago and each group developed their own culture and religion. When the Hammer hit, the people in the coastal area there, like most coastal settlements, were hit hard and they most definitely had to leave to find shelter in places nearby. I think that Andals as a group were people from around that area that through the Rhoyne reached Andalos, around the time the Hammer of the Waters occurred. It makes sense for them to use the rivers and not the sea to move around since it was safer. It makes sense that they would move around for years. It makes sense how they learned the art of forging steel since not only they were close to the Rhoynar, but they would have passed through all the Rhoynish cities to reach the area they finally settled. Your smith must have been Rhoynish, Illyrio quipped. The Andals learned the art of working iron from the Rhoynar, who dwelled along the river. This is known. In general, the whole story of Tyrion in Dance is a parallel, I think. His name is Hugor Hill, and he passes through the Rhoyne. The Andals are more tricky, because I think that the first of them did indeed go to the Vale soon after the Hammer. After staying in Andalos for a while and expanding there, some of them went to the closest to Essos area of Westeros, meaning the Vale. And that would explain why the earlier Andal groups had much more in common with the Ironborn than the later ones. The Andals were very much present in Essos up until 2000 years ago. This is why many maesters suggest that the Andals came to Westeros then. But migrations happen in multiple waves more often than not. The Valyrians were gradually expanding as well, so it makes sense that the Andals would leave for Westeros to avoid them. The Andals used to live in Andalos, and at some point they expanded all the way to Lorath, but it is suggested that the area where Volantis is today also had some Andal settlements prior to the Valyrians. At the mouth of the Rhoyne, the Valyrians founded the first of their colonies. Their Volantis was raised by some of the wealthiest men of the freehold in order to gather up wealth that flowed down the Rhoyne, and from Volantis their conquering forces crossed the river in great strength. The Andals might have fought against them at first, and the Rhoyner might even have aided them, but the tide was unstoppable, so it is likely the Andals chose to flee rather than face the inevitable slavery that came with Valyrian conquest. The Andals were seafarers, and it makes sense for them to have had some settlements there as well as north of the river, since it would have been a great place for something like that. They already had decent relationship with the Rhoyners, who unlike the Andals were trading through the river and not in the open sea for most of their time. It would have been a very beneficial relationship between the two, and it explains why the Rhoyners would try to support the Andals, since they were the main group of people they traded with, both from the north and the south. We saw that the moment the majority of the Andals fled from Westeros, the Valyrians founded Volantis, the city grew powerful trading with Valyria, and the nearby Rhoynish cities like Sarhoi declined, and this led to the Rhoynish Wars. If some Andals indeed lived in these places, meaning south of the Rhoyne, even very few of them in settlements, when they fled, they most definitely would settle in Dorne, since it is the closest to them, and that would also explain the Valyrian-sounding Andal names in Dorne like Illyrian and Santagar. They were in close proximity to the Valyrians for quite some time, and they obviously were to some extent influenced by them. Plus, when the Rhoyners reached Dorne as well, the Martells allied with them just fine. The relationships were more than okay with some of them. As for the sea-related Valyrians like the Velaryons, again we get some answers. Prior to the dragons, the place most likely had port cities and trading settlements, and the most important people would have been traders and seafarers like the Velaryons and the Celtigars. The religion was a water-related one, and when the Dragon Lords came into power, the power dynamics changed enough for people to leave this area. We have already been told that around 2000 years ago, there was a Valyrian religious schism, and people were leaving Valyria. And if other port cities controlled by Dragon Lords started to gain power as well, then families like the Velaryons and the Celtigars would have been affected and naturally moved to greener pastures. I think that these groups of people having a similar place of origin explains many things in the story. The similarities between them, the weird artifacts, and the houses that are very much not Firstmen in origin but very, very old, do not sound as odd. The Danes are a very weird situation, and this is why I didn't talk about them here. But it is only one house, not a group of people like the Ironborn, for example, that I find impossible to have been from freaking Asai. I'm sorry. So, yeah, I think that the Ironborn and the Andals were originally from the Valyrian Peninsula, and due to different events and circumstances, migrated to other areas. I hope you had fun watching this video. If you did, like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you very, very much for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye!